Hey, what's up, nerds? Paul here at Radio Free Hammer Hall. And today I'm just going to sort of muse on and have a little discussion about an idea that I really had batting around in my head a lot lately, and kind of a different perspective that I've been taking on Age of Sigmar. And I can basically sum it up by saying this: the competitive tournament meta, I think, for the majority of games that the majority of players will be playing, is completely irrelevant. Now, I'm going to include in that games at GTs, games at your local tournaments. So, why would I say that the competitive meta doesn't matter even when you're competing? Well, most of us are pretty average players, right? Like, I would imagine, I don't know necessarily how competitive my audience is, but just speaking for players in general, the majority of the pack is just somewhere in the middle. You know, you having a 2-3 or a 3-2 finish at the GT, you're there more to, make friends, hang out with your friends than to actually like try and win. Because you go in, you kind of know you're not. You maybe you'll have a good day, go 4-1, and you'll maybe win like best in faction or something like that, or maybe you're competing in painting, or maybe you're going for sportsmanship. That's certainly um a very worthwhile thing to be doing, is just going for the sportsmanship vote. So, coming back around to my point that the competitive tournament meta, as we usually think of it, I think isn't actually that important for average players. And the reason I say that is, although those competitive lists exist, those competitive armies exist, there may be a certain percentage of them at a tournament, but how many rounds out of a 5-round tournament are you going to face those kinds of armies? Especially if you're a middle of the pack, batting 500 kind of player. Not that many, right? And especially for players that don't venture out to GTs, that are just playing in their local scene, their club, their local shop, their local tournaments, hanging out in the basement with their friends, that tournament meta is completely irrelevant, like 99% of the time. Because what matters is, what are the players that you're actually playing with regularly playing? I will tell you, just as an example, my local meta: 3 dominant armies: Daughters of Cain, Slanesh, Tzeentch. 3 powerhouse armies that put up crazy records, win GTs all the time. No one in my local meta plays them. Those armies don't exist to me unless I go to a GT. And even when I go to a GT, the last one I went to, I played against Slanesh once. And it wasn't that bad of a Slanesh game. I was pretty much losing from the outset, but it wasn't like a ridiculous blow me off the table turn 2 kind of a Slanesh game. So my point is really that you need to tailor your list building to what your actual expectations are. And what I find myself doing, although all of those popular competitive armies just don't exist in my local meta, we have a high amount of Aussie Arc Bone Reapers players. So I've got to deal with the idea of, I got to crack my opponent's armor. That is a high priority for me, is dealing with blocks of Mortek Guard that are hard to kill. So, and on top of that, what else do you have a lot of? There's a lot of Stormcast around. Um, there's a lot of Iron Jaws locally as well for me. So all of these armies are like, 4-up saves or better. So, I have to worry more about a Maw Crusher that has an ethereal amulet than I have to worry about, you know, Daughters of Cain. Like Daughters of Cain just doesn't come up. Our our local meta doesn't have those things. And your local meta might not have those things either. And I think the important thing to note is even when your local meta may have those things present, you have the ability within a gaming group of people that all know each other to just kind of have that social contract where, or alternatively, if you don't want to think of it as social contract, you can think of it as peer pressure. You can just peer pressure people out of playing certain armies, playing certain lists. Like Tzeentch is fine as long as you're not taking horrors and flamers, right? Like it's good. It's a good army, but it's a fair army. And as long as you're not taking the broken things. So just let your local players know, or simply don't play against them. You can really create peer pressure by someone saying, hey, do you want to play a game? And you say, what army do you have? And if they say Slaanesh, you just say, no, I don't want to have a game. I'm going to find somebody else. Or I already plan on having a game with this guy over here. I have seen this happen also just for social issues. Sometimes you get someone whose behavior, on a more personal person-to-person level isn't on point with the rest of the group, and they just sort of peer pressure them out. And they kind of send the message like, hey, you're doing this thing that we don't like. Don't do that or we're not going to play with you. It's very simple. Like you can correct your local meta simply by putting it out there that like the thing that you're doing is not fun. And I don't see a lot of people out there that are going to play like Tzeentch or Slaanesh. And it's like, oh, I've got my 2,000 point list and that's exactly what I own. And that's the only thing I have. It's the only thing I play. A lot of times people have big collections and have a lot of armies. Or, you can even, if it's somebody that you know well or somebody that you like and they happen to only have that one army, you can just say, hey, look, like that army is really not fun to play against. Borrow one of mine and we'll have a game. You can work these things out. So although in the competitive meta right now, like Tzeentch is a huge problem and people all over Twitter are just blowing up and bitching up one side and down the other about it. Like for me personally, Tzeentch doesn't exist, right? Like I go to a tournament, there's no Tzeentch players. I go to a tournament, there's no Slaanesh players. I've literally played against Slaanesh once ever. Well, wait, twice ever. So I can't really be overly concerned about it. I get a lot of games in and I don't have those bad games against these bad armies. And even when there's something abusive that's available out there, like, my local Bone Reapers players figured out pretty quickly that nobody wants to play against Petrifex Elite, so they're not playing it. They're using other sub-factions. They're building interesting lists. Maybe they're focusing more on their painting or something like that. We just don't have. We've built a culture locally that just kind of says that's not okay. And by doing that, we have a lot of fun. Like we have our, Wednesday night game night. We have, like 10 or more people on a regular basis. We do leagues pretty much constantly. Like we'll do a league and that league will end and then we'll start another one a couple of weeks later. And and we rotate through games as well. We'll do Age of Sigmar, we'll do Warcry, we'll do maybe we'll do Path to Glory Age of Sigmar or an Escalation League Age of Sigmar, or a narrative Age of Sigmar, and flip back to Warcry. And if we had more players locally that played Underworlds, we'd probably do that too, but it just happens to not be popular locally. So, and then we have tournaments locally as well, where everybody breaks out their 2,000 point Age of Sigmar army and throws down the most competitive thing they've got. And when we do that, like, big stuff comes up. Like, what won my most recent local tournament? It was a Gristlegore list with 3 Terrorgeists and Vampire Lord on Zombie Dragon. Like, it exists. My local players have these armies. They just don't bring them to the table because it's not fun. And I think that's the big thing that people really need to focus on is what are the majority of my games actually like? What factions am I actually playing against? When I list build for a GT, my mindset is not I'm going to be on the top tables. So I really barely even consider, like, what do I do against Slanesh? What do I do against Tzeentch? What do I do against Skaven? All of those sorts of things. I have a much bigger concern about, like, what do I do against Stormcast Eternals? Like, I've got to deal with their armor. Like, they all have strong saves. What do I do against a Star Drake with a 2-up rerollable save? Like, I've got to be able to deal with that thing or I'm in trouble. What do you do against Khorne? What do you do against Ironjaws? A lot of these kind of like middle table armies, if you're a middle table player, like, that's what you're going to play against. And if you like go skim down the Honest Wargamer / LLV stats, like, if you look at that quote unquote fat middle, that's what most people need to actually prepare for playing against. That's probably what most of your local meta is. And even when you have, some of those higher performing armies, they might not be playing the high performing list out of those high performing armies because nobody wants to play against that unless you're just a very competitive minded sort of person. And your idea of a fun Friday night is, a change host versus Gristlegore, slugfest to see who can do the most dirty tricks. That's not for everybody. So many of my games are just, against a suboptimal build of, say, of Ossiarch Bone Reapers, or against Caradhran Overlords, or a Skaven build that has, like, that's just far from the top tables lists. That's not sending Storm Fiends over a bridge. It's not sending a ton of Plague Monks across the table. It's just stock normal all-comers kind of Skaven list. And because of that, like, I have so much fun playing Age of Sigmar because we're playing more balanced armies, or we're playing a sort of game mode, so to speak, like either Path to Glory or an Escalation League, where it's not just bring 2,000 points of ass kicking. It's, what did I roll on a table? What can I fit in this week's force? Or, depending on the rules of, like, an Escalation League, like, what do I put in my army now so that my army next week can work better? It all depends. And that's really why I say that, like, the tournament meta of what's going on at the top tables just doesn't affect most people. And I really wish that we had more conversations about playing Age of Sigmar in general and those armies in the fat middle and how you compete against various different armies. Um, how do you deal with uh, Nurgle being super tough? How do you deal with, Caradron Overlords shooting? If you're an army that's, say, like really dependent on your heroes or something like that. I think it's really important. And that's a lot of the conversations that we have on YouTube, on podcasts, are about these competitive armies. And I think they shouldn't be, because that's not the game experience that most people have. Your game experience is, whatever armies your friends bring to the table. And you have the ability, unless you're at a tournament, to just say no to these armies that are not fun to play against. You don't have to have a negative play experience if you don't want to. Unless you're being paired in a tournament against somebody that's going to give you a negative play experience, you shouldn't ever be having a negative